Okay.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Liverpool Irish Festival's event on Wilde and the Ballad of Reading Gaol. We'd love to be able to see your faces. If you're happy to come on camera, it's really nice for the speaker to know that he's speaking to a room full of people. But if you would prefer to stay off camera, that's also fine. We are live streaming on YouTube, so this event will be available for you to watch after this, because obviously it's going to be incredibly riveting and full of facts, so you're going to want to take notes and crib sheets and review again later, I'm sure. We're really delighted to have Declan with us today and to be celebrating 125 years of Wilde's incredible work, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. Declan is a reader in late Victorian culture at LJMU, and we're really proud to partner with one of our city's great institutions. So thanks ever so much for being here. What we're going to do is we're going to do a Q&A at the end, but if a question's really present and you want to hold on to it, please drop it in the chat and I will pick it up in the Q&A after the presentation from Declan. So thanks for being here. Declan, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Emma, and thanks everybody for coming along. Míle bríochas so chuí as an lech seo a frastal líne inniu faoin Tower, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. So the Oscar Wilde's the Ballad of Reading Gaol, 125 years of art, culture and progress is the theme of this. And the poem was published, as Emma said, 125 years ago, so it's a very auspicious date. And I think with the reading of any literary work, it's always worth thinking about the moment of its publication and its reception, its place in history, and also the ways in which it speaks to us today, the ways in which it's spoken through the decades or years since its publication up until our current moment, and to think of ourselves as really engaging in a form of dialogue with the author, with his readers throughout history, and with the moment and moments to which it speaks as well. I teach mostly late Victorian and 19th century literature and early 20th century literature. I have a deep interest really in the cultural politics that really informs literary writing. And I always encourage my students to do this because there's a sense, Barthes, the great French critic, penned an essay entitled The Death of the Author, in which he tells us that when a literary text is written, it goes out into the world and is really bid farewell to by the author. But I actually don't agree with that. I think something of the author always lives on. I think that something of the author in his time, his beliefs, is humanity, and certainly in Wilde's case is humaneness as well, and engenderingness in a very masculine way, and for those women who write, for her, all of her values as well, and beliefs and engagements with power and resistance to power as well. All of these things really contribute to our understanding of what it is to be a person, what it is to be human within history, against the context of history. And it's always very empowering. So I think it's worth reading The Ballad of Reading Gaol. It's something that, while it's set and very much about a particular moment in the 1890s, the 1896, July 1896 execution of Thomas Henry Wilde, a prisoner who had been sentenced to death for the murder of his wife. It's something that also, I think, very much speaks to questions of justice and questions and themes and problems of power and the carceral state, and also colonialism as well, and questions of class too, because these are very, I think, very important themes that run throughout Wilde's life, but also through the poem as well. I may just take these glasses off for a second. I don't know what it's like for the viewers, but I have to wear them because of glares and screens and so on. But I just realized I'm getting a big square reflection from my other screen. So it's certainly distracting for me, never mind the viewers, those attending. So what I'm going to do is shift between a PowerPoint presentation that I have here, and also, let's see if you can excuse me for a second, some notes that I'll just forget about those for now. And I'll stick with the PowerPoint slides, but if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask those too afterward or during the chat. So I'll just go to share screen and screen 2. So Emma, is that okay? Is that visible?
It isn't yet, Declan.
Aha.
It's moving now.
Great,
Yep,
great. So
we're on your front slide.
You're on the slide. Okay. So on the first slide, so that's just an introduction. If you have any questions there, my email address is there too, and I'm sure if anybody wants to, I can include that in the chat as well as we proceed. So, the Ballad of Reading Gaol in relation to art, culture, and progress. We think of ourselves as being in a moment of progress, or as history is really a phenomenon that leads towards some kind of progressive end. But it's worth thinking about, and Wilde is very concerned about this and fascinated with the possibility, the fact that history and progress had to be really struggled for. Historical progress was something that we could not really achieve passively. It took active participation and struggle. Wilde was a deeply politicized and political writer. Since his death posthumously, he had been in many ways contained by literary criticism, by the literary establishment, the political establishment, and the cultural establishment as well. Wilde was often held to be an effete kind of apolitical, socially disengaged author, and he was anything but. He was deeply committed to politics, to progressive politics and to human liberation. And from what I've read of all of his work, I've been working on Wilde now for 14 years. I've been doing a lot of deep archival research on Wilde since 2009. And what I've found is that in his letters, in all of his literary works, in his correspondence, in his manuscripts, and his journalism as well, he was very much committed to the cause of human progress. And I'll go through that as we proceed. One thing that really informed Wilde's literary writing and his literary imagination and his cultural pronouncements, as well as an aesthete. Aestheticism is the movement of which Wilde was a leading figure, and as an aesthete or aesthete, can be pronounced either way. Wilde has been, I think, repackaged, represented, and sometimes misrepresented as an apolitical figure, as I mentioned. But Wilde grew up in Ireland, the colonial state, the occupied colony of Ireland. He was born in Dublin in 1854, and Dublin was a heavily policed city, as was the rest of Ireland, disproportionately in comparison to other European countries. Throughout the 19th century, Ireland actually had a larger British garrison than even India, the colony of India, which was gigantic. And Wilde's friend and his first biographer, Robert Harborough Sherard, in his book published in 1906, his biography, The Life of Oscar Wilde, recalled visiting Wilde in prison. And while Wilde was there, they were discussing the case of Robert Emmet, one of Wilde's great heroes. Robert Emmet led a rebellion in Ireland against British rule in 1803. And for that, as part of that, he was executed, but prior to his execution, he gave a powerful, brilliant speech from the dock. So Sherard recalls, "We had been talking of Robert Emmet when I incidentally remarked that it was very curious that he, an atheist, should have made so many allusions to the Supreme Being and a future state in the course of his speech from the dock. That was no doubt due to his Celtic temperament," said Oscar Wilde. "Those who are governed by their emotions are more given to hero worship and the worship of the gods than practical people who believe in logic and are governed by what they choose to term their reason. Imaginative people will invariably be religious people for the simple reason that religion has sprung from the imagination. And what really fascinates me about this quotation from Sherard's book is that, and this was published not long after Wilde's death, Sherard's book emphasizes Wilde's political commitment, his admiration for the Paris Commune and so on, which was suppressed in 1871 with great bloodshed. What we have here are a number of issues that really inform the picture of, or sorry, not the picture of Dorian Gray. I was just teaching it last week, excuse me, the Ballad of Reading Gaol. It also informs Dorian Gray, but we'll stick to the ballad for now. What we have is really a call for decolonization that Robert Emmet expressed. We hear a lot these days in the universities about decolonizing the curriculum and decolonizing everything, which is very admirable. And I think it's very important also to bear in mind that we also have to think about what being decolonial will detach us from, and Wilde was very conscious of that. So, and I'll return to that in relation to the poem, to the ballad. Wilde emphasizes Emmet's Celtic temperament, Robert Emmet's Celtic temperament, and there's a lot of work has been done on this construction of the Celt, the Irishman, the Scot, the Welsh, and the Breton, and so on, as people who are governed by emotions. But what Wilde was actually trying to get people to think about was this sense of romantic possibility, and that in relation to that great movement against centralized aristocratic power, really the romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And he also emphasizes the imagination. The imagination is a realm that can resist colonization, and there's no more colonial space than the prison. And that's something to think about, especially when we look at our circumstances today, when we live in a very carceral world indeed. So in another work, another one of Wilde's prison pieces, the essay, it begins as a powerful letter to his lover Alfred Douglas, which he composed over several months in prison from roughly January to, I think it was January to April 1897, just prior to his release. Wilde described the anarchist revolutionary Peter Kropotkin in similarly religious visionary terms. So, as we saw in the previous quotation, Robert Emmet was a figure who, for all of his atheism, drew on the divine, and he saw the divinity, according to Wilde, in the oppressed, as did Peter Kropotkin. Anarchism was the ideology that argued that we should not be governed, that we're capable of governing ourselves. And what Wilde encountered in prison was the polar opposite of that, and that is the centralized power, the centralized authority, and the politically sanctioned violence of the state. And in De Profundis, he tells us that he described Kropotkin, Peter Kropotkin, who himself had been imprisoned in St. Petersburg by the Tsarist authorities in Russia. He then eventually he escapes from imprisonment in Siberia, makes his way to Britain, and Wilde met him and admired him deeply. He described him in terms of being a radical embodiment of the divine, and in De Profundis describes him as possessing the soul of that beautiful white Christ coming out of Russia. And these are works that are published prior to the ballad and written prior to the Ballad of Reading Gaol. And what I want you to all to think about is really Wilde's emphasis on the divine, on the repressed, on the colonized, and also on the incarcerated as well. And when we think of prisoners, they really are the most marginalized members of our human brotherhood, as Wilde put it, of our society. And it's very true that I forget who came up, who actually said this in the first place, but and I should remember this, but the measure of any society really is the measure according which any society ought to be judged is the treatment of its prisoners. And I say that as a child of a former prisoner myself. I think it's something that's really, really important. And Wilde, shortly after his release, we don't know the exact date of the letter's composition, but it was sent to Michael Davitt in late May or early June 1897. Michael Davitt was one of the great heroes of Irish history, a leader of the Irish Land League, which campaigned for land reform and very much broke the power of the aristocratic Anglo-Irish ascendancy in Ireland. Wilde wrote to Michael Davitt about the terrible treatment of, and actually the use of corporal punishment in prisons against prisoners, and particularly children as well, birching and so on. And Davitt himself had served time. He was imprisoned for 7 years for his part in the Fenian organization. He was a member of the Fenian movement, which was the Irish Militant Republican organization, the forerunner of what's now known as the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. No one knows better than yourself how terrible life is in an English prison, and what cruelties result from the stupidities of officialism and the immobile ignorance of centralization. You know what prison life is, and that there is no exaggeration in what I say. I have no bitterness at all, but I have learned pity, and that is worth learning if one has to tramp a yard for 2 years to learn it. All of this was really the context that traditionally the Ballad of Reading Gaol was not interpreted or taught against. And I think it's very important because it's a deeply political intervention. And it was one that really, Wilde was circulating his ideas. Michael Davitt was an MP at this time, and already a world famous humanitarian figure as well. And Wilde had been in touch with figures including Kropotkin prior to his imprisonment. He moved really in some very famous circles, and he continued to do so after imprisonment. And I think it's very important too to recall that while Wilde is depicted as a character who's broken after his imprisonment and release in 1897, he served 2 years hard labour. As Nicholas Frankl, the scholar, has shown, Wilde biographer Frankl, in his book The Unrepentant Years, shows that Wilde came out of prison anything but broken, and all the more determined to really stand up for the most marginalised, those who were really who composed the most repressed classes in society. And this is again this is from his letter to Alfred Douglas, which is eventually re-edited and then published as De Profundis. And he echoes this what he said to Michael Davitt in that letter. I now see that sorrow, being the supreme emotion of which man is capable, is at once the type and the test of all great art. So Wilde is now aligning his experience with the possibility, and he's written this while he's in prison. He's actually planning to really to engage in more literary writing, more cultural production, more artistic engagement with these issues. What the artist is always looking for is the mode of existence in which soul and body are one and indivisible, in which the outward is expressive of the inward, in which form reveals. Soul, body, this is subjectivity, this is human being, this is what he's telling us about. It's worth thinking about this question of the soul as well. In terms of it functions in a religious register, certainly, and it also functions in a humanist register too. The soul, that which really elementally makes us, the psyche, as Freud might call it. Truth in art is the unity of a thing with itself. The outward rendered expressive of the inward, the soul made incarnate, the body instinct with spirit. For this reason, there is no truth comparable to sorrow. So he's telling us then that his prison experience is actually revealing to him the ultimate truth, the truth of sorrow. There's not a single wretched man in this wretched place along with me who does not stand in symbolic relation to the very secret of life. For the secret of life is suffering. It is what is hidden behind everything. And earlier in that letter, he tells Alfred Douglas that he himself stood in symbolic relation to the culture of his own time. So Wilde is also saying that while I was very famous, I was possibly the most famous public intellectual of my time, which I think he was, he's also telling us that these prisoners are also very much in symbolic relation to the very secret of life itself, and through their experience and this kind of community of suffering, Wilde has experienced and been enlightened as to their condition. And he calls this the mysticism of sympathy. This was cooperation that motivated the true artist who, like Christ, finds beauty among the masses and the sufferings, as he describes those whose name, among the sufferings of those whose name is Legion. And we're looking here really as well at the relationship between art and democracy. Okay, and this is key to Wilde's prison writings. I've written a chapter all about this in my book, Oscar Wilde and the Radical Politics of the Fin de Siècle. And his prison writings were anything but a retreat from the social. They amplified and highlighted his increased engagement. And prior to imprisonment, he was really engaged with the social. That's a whole other talk. But you can read all of that into all of his literary writings. So for Wilde, then, those whose name is Legion were the poor, the dispossessed, and the colonized. He was deeply concerned about the colonized, and you can read all about that, for example, in his fairy tale, The Young King, which actually corresponds with, and thematically, the story ends, it's published, I think, in 1887, and it ends with imagery that reappears in the Ballad of Reading Gaol, the blooming staff that the young king possesses, and which is also something that's discussed in relation to the prisoners, a staff that blooms with flowers with red and white roses. Wilde maintained that beauty was a democratizing phenomenon, and art was democratizing, discernible among those whose dwelling is in the tombs, oppressed nationalities, factory children, thieves, people in prison, outcasts, those who are dumb and under oppression, and whose silence is only heard of God, is heard only of God. And so just think about that in relation to, because I'm forever drawing analogies and comparisons, but think about what's going on in Gaza today in relation to that. I think it's very, very relevant, and that's how I teach literature. I argue that there is alignment and that there are correspondences and parallels, examples of suffering and oppression and resistance to that the artist can really, the resistance that the artist can offer in times of repression. So in a letter to the editor of the Daily Chronicle on the 27th of May, again, this is right after his release from prison, Wilde tells us, and these are some very, 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 very sad photographs of child prisoners. The letter was written in defense of a man called Warden Martin. I think his name was Thomas Martin. He was a prison warden who committed the terrible crime of feeding biscuits to a child who was in a terrible state after he'd been committed to prison. So children were sent to prison for all kinds of things like shoplifting and so on. I think that was generally it, minor petty theft, that type of thing. Authority, he tells us, is as destructive to those who exercise it as it is to those in whom it is exercised. It is the prison board and the system that carries it out. That it carries out. That is the primary source of the cruelty that is exercised on a child in prison. The people who uphold the system have excellent intentions. Those who carry it out are humane in intention also. Responsibility is shifted onto the disciplinary regulations. It is supposed that because a thing is the rule, it is the right. Okay, that's the Nuremberg defense that he's talking about. This is back in the 1890s. And through his communication then with Michael Davitt was able to raise this issue in Parliament as well. And then we turn to the poem itself, The Ballad of Reading Gaol by C33. That was Wilde's prison number. So the poem, it's very, very quotable. It's all very familiar. I have a lot of quotations here. I may skip through some of these because I think of about 24 of them, probably way too many. And in the poem, it tells us that some kill their love when they are young, and some when they are old. Some strangle with the hands of lust, some with the hands of gold. The kindest use a knife because the dead so soon grow cold. But he's actually asking us to think about really are the various circumstances and conditions. And as a Marxist scholar as well, I'm very interested in the hands of gold. You know, that's and he does refer to the social and to the economic as he continues throughout the poem, and capital is very much a dehumanizing phenomenon that he interrogates and critiques throughout his literary writings. The kindest use a knife. Wildridge had actually murdered his wife. He killed her with a blade, with a knife as well. And he's trying to get us to think about really to try and sort of perhaps think about crime, violence as something that's across society in a very lateral way, and yet the prison system focuses on individual crime, individual offences, and so on. And again, think of those children, petty larceny as it might have been described. Yeah, that's what those faces represent. Those were real people. So another theme that really recurs here too is the theme of the strangeness of bearing witness to the divinity of the prisoners, to their compassion, and to their humaneness in an incredibly inhumane system. That's an early woodcut illustration, I think, of the new jail at Reading from that would have been probably very early 19th century, I would say. Kilmainham Jail in Ireland is built according to a similar panoptical system. I think it was opened in 1793. So these prisons are all of a moment. The panoptical system is a prison within which everything can be seen from a central area. Crumlin Road Jail in Belfast. I think Walton Prison here in Liverpool that's also a panoptical prison as well. And Michel Foucault has written about that. But what Wilde is telling us here is really underlining the strangeness of the experience then of really bearing witness to this. So it's another kind of observation, but by the prisoners, and it counters the constant surveillance of the panoptical prison and also the panoptical state. Strange it was to see him pass, this is Woolwich, the prisoner with a condemned man. He's been sentenced to death. He's come to Reading Jail to be hanged, with a step so light and gay. And strange it was to see him look so wistfully at the day. And strange it was to think that he had such a debt to pay. And again, this notion of justice as a debt that must be met. There's an entirely, I think there is a whole weirdly economic rationale at work as well with this notion of indebtedness to the state. And Wilde is really criticizing this. And of course, he tells us that then in Debtor's Yard, this is the next stanza, the stones are hard and the dripping wall is high. So it was there he took the air beneath the leaden sky, and by each side a warder walked for fear the man might die. Woolridge, like any condemned man in the 19th century, late Victorian period in particular, was accompanied constantly by two wardens as he took his exercise, and he was under constant watch. Ironically, he takes his walk across Debtor's Yard. I presume that's separate from the other prisoners who tended to, they would have a separate walk and so on, sometimes in the Breaker's Yard. And you'll see that in Kilmainham Jail, where the prisoners walked around. The other terrible fact about this, and the same thing happened in Crumlin Road Jail, when people were executed, when they were hanged, they were quicklime. Their bodies were buried in quicklime, which would dissolve their remains, and they were buried in these yards. So he's walking around the yard under which he's going to be buried. Okay, and there's the Invincibles Yard in Kilmainham Jail, which is associated with the Invincibles, the Irish Republican group, members of which were hanged and buried there. It was also countless, we'll never know, we just don't have a statistic for it, but an immeasurable number of people, including children, were hanged and buried there as well. And that's what Wilde, coming from his mother was a member of the Irish Republican movement as well, the Young Ireland movement, and what Wilde wants us to think about. He was very conscious of political prisoners, as you've seen with his correspondence with David, but he wants us to think about too the ordinary prisoner as well. And I think that's incredibly important today, to think about, there's a certain, sometimes a distinction between types of category of prisoner. and Wilde wanted us to think about all of them as human beings. And twice a day he smoked his pipe and drank his quart of beer. The soul was resolute and held no hiding place for fear. He often said that he was glad the hangman's hands were near. And this is the strange thing that the students, well, sorry, Freudian slip there, that the prisoners are really experiencing. They're observing a man who has resigned himself to that, and he is fearless in the face of that which has the prisoners terrorized. And Wilde describes incarceration as an experience of terror. And this is the result of this. This is the silence that really was enforced on the prisoners as well. In some prisons, they were forced to wear masks during their exercise. I think Wilde, I can't remember if it's a while since I read his biographies, but if Wilde had to wear the cloth mask, they weren't allowed to look at or communicate with one another. And that's the closure of voice, mind, and hope. And that's about breaking the soul, as Wilde would put it, breaking the consciousness of the prisoner too. What should human pity do, pent up in murderer's hold? What word of grace in such a place could help a brother's soul? And the prisoners see one another as brothers, which is very important as well, because prisoners are supposed to be the most isolated, the most atomized, the most separated, let's say, the most marginal portion of society. And yet there's a really powerful solidarity. And as the ballad proceeds, Wilde describes how these prisoners collectively pray for the soul of Ulrich, and also how they have this kind of community or communion, as Wilde would put it as well, kind of community or communion of suffering as well. And for Wilde, that was the most. This theme runs through all of his writing up until his imprisonment, but it's one then that really becomes very amplified after his release in 1897. So what we have here, sorry, I've just mixed up the heading titles there, but the surveillance panoptical prison and society is very important. If you just think of surveillance and panopticism, if you go to Tesco today, you'll be recorded on a video camera buying your sushi and Diet Coke. Certainly I have been multiple times, and it's the principle of the panopticon that we still live with, that surveillant authority. It's not just the state that engages in this now, it's the very supermarkets. So in this sense, Wilde then is asking us really to think about the ways in which the prisoner is observed, watched, and controlled, and also the ways in which perhaps people on the outside might be too. He lay as one who lies and dreams in a pleasant meadowland. The watchers watched him as he slept and could not understand how one could keep so sweet a sleep with hangman close at hand. And this surveillance is then countered by the prisoner's vigil for Woolwich. They counter the surveillance of the state, of that surveillance state, apart, and in doing so, they curate or create a parallel world of care and solidarity. There is no sleep when men must weep who never yet have wept. So we, the fool, the fraud, the knave, that endless vigil kept, and through each brain, on hands of pain, another's terror crept. So this solidarity is lessening. They believe, the suffering of the prisoner, but through each of those imaginations, each of those minds, the fear, the violence, the terror that really they imagine Woolridge to be being subjected to be experiencing, they're trying to absorb some of that. And this is was the question of solidarity. It tells us that as molten lead, the tears we shed for the blood we had not spilt. Okay, that this is really this is profound agonizing here. This is direct identification with the prisoners. The warders with their shoes of felt crept by each padlocked door. They wore felt shoes so the condemned man wouldn't hear them. They wanted him kept in total isolation, and peeped and saw with eyes of awe grey figures on the floor, and wondered why men knelt to pray who never prayed before. And so we see again this really, for Wilde, it was a manifestation of divinity, of the divine. And remember, he's already been talking about Kropotkin in this way, and he's already written about the poor, the dispossessed, and the colonized in this manner, especially in his fairy tales. And that's just the hangman's drop there in the prison. Sometimes prisoners were taken outside, but in many of these Victorian prisons, they were this is actually a very modern device, the floor trap that was really developed through the 19th century. Rather, it was a room with a built-in gallows, so it was like indoor hanging. Tom Williams, who was hanged in Crumlin Road, the IRA prisoner in the 1940s, was hanged similarly, and the room is still there. You can go and visit it in Crumlin Road. And Wilde tells us that for man's grim justice goes its way and will not swerve aside. It slays the weak, it slays the strong, it has a deadly stride. With iron heel it slays the strong, the monstrous parricide. So justice is unswervable. You can't negotiate with it, you can't reason with it. And it slays the weak and the strong in its deadly stride. The hangman, I think his name was Bettington, I forget the exact surname, but the hangman who hanged Thomas Woolwich, he was the principal, he had the main contract for carrying out these executions, and his three sons went into the job after him, and the first one who took on the role lasted for a month because he fell through the hangman's trap in one of his early commissions, and died as a result of his injuries. You know, this deadly stride has a very democratizing, I suppose, in some ways, scope. This is the inside, just an image of the inside of a panoptical prison. I think it's actually a French prison, but it's not dissimilar to Kilmainham Jail in Dublin. And famously, Wilde writes that he'd never seen sad men who looked with such a wistful eye upon that little tent of blue we prisoners called the sky, and at every careless cloud that passed in happy freedom by. That has a real resonance for me, because my father was interned in Long Kesh for nearly 4 years, and he always says that when he got out, the thing that really struck him was colour and distance, being able to look in the distance as well. So, and he did say that when the sky was blue, it was wonderful. Everything's grey. That's why prisons are painted grey. Yep. Sometimes a lot of schools as well, unfortunately, these days. Even hospitals. So it's I think that's a very powerful stanza. And then justice summons horror and terror of the carceral state. This is the original by Gustave Doré of prisoners doing the round, that the earlier image, the coloured image that was adapted so brilliantly by Vincent van Gogh, that appears earlier in these power slides, is an adaptation of. Silently we went round, and through each hollow mind the memory of dreadful things rushed like a dreadful wind, and horror stalked before each man, and terror crept behind. And I think that's one of the most damning indictments, really, of the carceral system, is that it hollows out the mind. It really deadens the imagination. I have a colleague, Joe Sim, who's a radical criminologist, and we've talked about this at length, and he's met, he's worked closely with prisoners and prisons, and he said, when you just think about this, when you think about the denial of intellectual stimulation to prisoners, and I think England has one of the highest rates of reoffending in the world, and when you think of in the United States, we've similar problems with the 3 strikes and you're in or out law as well, any 3 convictions, including minor ones. And this is the terror, and this is why in many cases people run. They don't want to go back. And it's the memory of the dreadful things and horror that really quantifies every moment in prison. And Wilde also captures too the elastication, the stretching of time by the prison experience as well. And he writes about that in De Profundis too. And as I say, to think of the hollowing of the mind, it's just a terrible image. And that's what prisons still do. That's what the carceral system still does and in a letter with the time I'll quote from it, just towards the end, he says that prisons are supposed to reform, but they don't. So the prison system is what needs reformed. And what we have here is an image, as I mentioned, of the prison burial yard, usually the breaker's yard. So imagine too, having to work forced labour with the remains of fellow prisoners below you and buried in the yard. They become very much part of the structure of the prison itself. And with prison yard burial, what we have, the quick liming of Woolwich and his body, is the total erasure of the condemned man, removed from society and from history. And then the poem is really a reclamation of his very being, of his soul, as Wilde would put it. And this is what we have then as Wilde's poetry and all of his literary practice as a socially active process and practice. And he tells us that in this damned earth where they have quick-limed him, that for 3 long years they will not sow or root or seedling there. For 3 long years the unblessed spot will sterile be and bare, and look upon the wandering sky with unreproachful stare. So think about the prisoners looking up at the blue sky, looking for some hope and inspiration. And what we have here is total erasure. And these are matters that Wilde, again in 1897, is directly confronting here. Sorry, he writes the poem in 1897. It's published then in 1898. And he then asks, for who can say by what strange way Christ brings his staff to light, since the barren staff the pilgrim bore bloomed in the great folk's sight? And again, he's interested. This is an image that reappears in his story, The Young King, which is all about a king who realizes that all of his power, his wealth, and his privilege are based on violent structures. And we have a quotation from it just here, yeah. And I'll not read entirely from this, but if anybody wants to see this, I can send the slides on to Emma, or you can email me and I can forward them to you. And this is when the young king is revealed to be a Christ-like figure, and you'll just see that highlighted there in yellow, a bit like Kropotkin, the anarchist revolutionary as well, and a bit like Woolridge, who we'll find out about shortly. Lo, through the painted windows came the sunlight streaming upon him, the young king. He's rejected the violent structures upon which his kingship is based. And the sunbeams wove round him a tissued robe that was fairer than the robe that had been fashioned for his pleasure. The dead staff, the staff that he carried, blossomed, and the bare lilies that were whiter than pearls. The dry thorn blossomed, and bare roses that were redder than rubies. Whiter than fine pearls were the lilies, and their stems were of bright silver. Redder than male rubies were the roses, and their leaves were of beaten gold, and so on. Well, I love these very ornate and elaborate descriptions of that which is beautiful, and so on. And the young king came down from the high altar and passed through the midst of the people, but no man dared look upon his face, for it was like the face of an angel. And he's also saying the divinity and the realization of social responsibility. You become fully human when you realize your role and responsibility to your fellow beings. And again, contrast this with the reality of suffering in the prison. This just is not possible. So we have what we call intertextuality here. This poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, is now speaking to the hint of possibility upon which the young king ends. Neither milk white rose nor red may bloom the prison air. The shard, the pebble, and the flint are what they give us there. That's the broken stones in the breaker's yard. For flowers have been known to heal a common man's despair. So never will wine red rose or white, petal by petal, fall in that stretch of mud and sand that lies by the hideous prison wall, to tell the men who tramp the yard that God's Son died for all. So it's a powerful democratizing consciousness of divinity. Okay, and this draws to, I think, too, from some of the radical English Kingdom Now philosophy that emerged after the English Civil War as well. And this is the famous. I'll just see how we're. Yep, see how I'm doing for time here. Sorry. So he then famously concludes that Wise it were, if each man could know the same, that every prison that men build is built with bricks of shame, and bound with bars, lest Christ should see how men their brothers maim. Again, these we'll all remember the poem. I'm sure many of you will have read it before, and it's one that we all turn to at some point. And and what I just really wanted to emphasize with this is Wilde's own emphasis on the humaneness of the prisoners who pray together, the worth, the human worth, the value of them, in a late 19th century system, a capitalist system, an imperialist system, a colonial system that really, within the prison walls, I think applies the techniques and the technologies of colonial violence, observation, and surveillance directly to a captive population as well. And when we think about, we're very interested today, thankfully, in ideas of solidarity, and techniques of solidarity, allyship, comradeship. I prefer to think of comradeship. I like to think of it in those terms. And when we think about solutions to problems, think of the Black Lives Matter movement and the tremendous solidarity that gave rise to. I think Wilde very much gives us, in this poem from 1898, a really interesting, I would say, interesting lesson on really the ways in which we can relate to one another. And he concludes by telling us that they do well to hide their hell, for in it things are done that son of God nor son of man should ever look upon. Against a terribly and damning indictment of the Victorian penal system. And I'll give the last word then to Wilde's letter to the editor of the Daily Chronicle, in which he tells us that prisoners are, as a class, and this is written in 1897, while he's composing this poem after his release, prisoners are, as a class, extremely kind and sympathetic to each other. Suffering and the community of suffering, this is really important for Wilde, the community of suffering, makes people kind. And day after day, as I tramped the yard, I used to feel with pleasure and comfort what Thomas Carlyle, the Victorian essayist and historian, what Carlyle calls somewhere the silent rhythmic charm of human companionship. And this is what the anarchist Peter Kropotkin called mutualism, and what the communists called comradeship. It's a lateral democratizing feeling of solidarity with your fellow people. And this, as in all other things, philanthropists and people of that kind are astray. These are the official reformers, the people who we entrust to reform things. The philanthropists whom he really criticized in The Soul of Man Under Socialism, his essay of 1892. It is not the prisoners who need reform, it is the prisons. So I'll perhaps conclude with that. And that's, of course, it was on the exhibition at Reading Jail, Wilde's Cell Door. It then went on to Paris, and was that exhibition with some of Wilde's early works and letters, and the famous portrait of him from the Clark Library at Los Angeles was really the popularity of this exhibition really, I think, spoke to the power of Wilde's views on this subject, and the ways then in which he really registered it through his literary writings as well. I'll conclude with that, though, and if anyone has any questions, please feel free. And I just realized that here we go. I've gone to stop share. You might be able to see me again.
Thanks ever so much, Declan. So first of all, what I'm going to invite everybody to do is unmute and give you a round of applause. So thank you for that.
Well done, Declan.
Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Declan. There have been
Thanks.
some questions come in through the chat. I'm going to throw to Fergal in the first instance, and we might try and see if Jerry's mic works. But Fergal, over to you.
All right. Afternoon, Declan. Good to see you, cuz.
You too, cuz. Great to see you. Thanks for coming.
No worries, I said I would. Right. The first thing I drew comparison with that struck out for me when you spoke about the prisoners having to wear the masks, I immediately thought about your dad straight away, you know, because it was something that continued to see from then on, and
Mm.
then the end. And I was thinking, do you think the jailing of the kids at that time is a carryover from when we used to ship everybody from England and Ireland off to Australia, given that
Yeah.
that was within 30 years of this, this
Mm.
poem being written, and to get away the bad element the same way that they jailed Wilde and all that as well? Do you think that maybe it was just a throw off, that it took a bit of time maybe to wind that down before they started going on again?
Mm. Well, I'll definitely, and I suppose there's those 2 points. With my father's case, he was one of the hooded men. That was a torture case, infamous torture case from the beginning of internment in 1971. And the methods of torture, they were called the 5 methods or 5 techniques, and they were used again in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib in Iraq. And those techniques included hooding and total sensory deprivation, severe beatings and drugging and waterboarding, all of that stuff. And that's something that I think with the hooding of the Victorian prisoners too, the hooded men could not see and could barely breathe out of those hoods that were forced on them, and the Victorian prisoners. But it was a similar principle. It was the total isolation of the subject and the breaking down of the mind that was attempted. It didn't work in that case with the hooded men, but it's something that was done en masse, certainly in the Victorian prison system. It was also done in Kenya as well. It was based on torture techniques from there, Kenya and with the child prisoners too, certainly Fergal, there's that continuum of violence and colonial type violence as well. In which children are very much seen as fair game by the penal system, the judicial system, and we still see that across the world, as well as you can see what's going on today in Gaza as well.
Obviously that ties in with one of our anthems, like the Fields of Athenry and things like
that's
that.
Right,
well.
So thanks ever so much for that question, Fergal. There's a couple of kind of observations really in the chat that I'm just going to pick up on. And it's interesting that obviously at the end of your presentation you showed the cell door, and Jerry was saying that actually that's on public view at the National Justice Museum now.
Right.
And Jamie had mentioned that it had been part of the Queer Britain exhibition last year, and what had struck them when they had seen the door was just how tiny that cell door was. Wilde's known to be quite a big guy. So the idea of that tiny door, I mean, everything is about compromising your scale, your position, your fundamental right to exist and be seen and bear witness.
Yes.
It's all kind of compromised by that, isn't it? Then Jerry sort of said, actually, just think of a wardrobe door is almost the kind of scaling of that. So while that picture was sort of interesting, it's amazing to note how many other people have kind of thinking, God, all of these things are so measured to cause harm and detriment, really, aren't they?
Yeah.
So question, Jerry, does your microphone work? Can we hear you? No, it doesn't seem like it. So I'm going to just read Jerry's questions. Excuse me for a moment while I find them. He said, the use of the word gay, as in happy and joyous, for its meaning at the time, he's wondered whether or not the poem itself has an influence on the current meaning and the kind of ownership of the word.
Well, it's funny. I often speak to Professor Joe Bristow at UCLA about what we now call queer theory, queerness, and queer studies, and certainly, it was once, the word queer was once a term of abuse for LGBTQ plus people, and Joe he's a leading queer studies scholar, and he often uses the term in a way as a sort of really an act of resistance too against that, and with gay becomes, I think it's early 20th century when that becomes into the 1940s, maybe post World War II as well. It comes up. Queer is running through that whole period, and what's actually interesting in Wilde's period is that it's actually unnameable. The love that dare not speak its name, as he describes it during his trial. And I should have said more to him, apologies, about queerness and Wilde's imprisonment for the act of, inverted commas, gross indecency between men loving other men. And this is so it's a classically queer text in that regard. And I think that, again, it's Joseph Bristow has written about this at length, the notion of that sense of solidarity, that because queer people, they're the people who are really, that in terms of what goes on in the world in terms of injustice, and they experience it in every regard too, don't they? And homophobia is also a colonial construction too, as we've seen in Ireland, because we didn't get rid of the Lavishere Amendment Act. We actually, it was still on the books until I think 1992 that homosexuality was decriminalised in Ireland. That was just 2 years before I went to university. Incredible stuff. I tell my students about that, and it's so in terms of the poem certainly presents us with, I think, a vision of hell on earth, and it is through Wilde's radical political. He was very much an anarchist and an Irish Republican. So you get anarchist solidarities there, you've got Irish Republican solidarities, and also queer solidarities that are very much at work in the poem too. And so it's very relevant. Without his imprisonment for being gay, you would not have had this poem. So it's very much a response to that violence as well.
It's interesting that you're picking up on the terminology of queer, and one of the things that Jerry had picked up on was the fact that Brendan Behan also had a preoccupation essentially with sort of the observation of capital punishment and what that meant to us as a society, and that the Queer Fellow was one of his works. But of course there is this difference in queer, those spellings, and whether or not that's a particularly Irish thing, which Fergal is saying, actually queer means lots of things.
Where me and Declan come from. Queer means a lot of things. We use it as a verb, as an adjective, and things like that. It's a bit like some swear words we use like that as well. But queer, it can mean anything from unusual to very. We use it as very as well. So it's one of those words. It may have derived from queer, and then maybe with the accents around the country then developed into queer. And queer we always took as a bit of slang, didn't we, Declan? So
we did,
me and Declan are cousins. We grew up together, so we used a lot of language that is used. We've seen a lot of language that is used in some of the poems and stuff like that as well. But it's just I know as growing up, Declan, I didn't, and I don't think you did. We never attached queer to queer.
Yeah, that's right. That's you say it's a queer day.
It's a queer day, is it?
Or
that's queer and good, that one.
He's a queer fella there, what I mean? Outstanding dude. Or she's a queer girl, And so
I mean, and that she's very good looking, a lovely woman. It's the terminology, so I can see where he links in with Behan. But it means something else for us. And as I say, we didn't even attach it to queer.
I think they use I remember the word queer coming in believe it or not, television culture probably was its introduction as opposed to queer for, certainly for us as kids growing up, queer is a term of abuse, and so on, and movies and television and so on. And then with Behan, you got the queer fella, and his Borstal Boy is one of the most queer texts, queer Irish texts ever written as well. And I remember being handed that, by a relative saying, that's a good Republican read that there. And I read it as about 12, 13, thinking, wow, when he's describing, is it Charlie, when he's Charlie's, he's giving Charlie a haircut with a razor, shaving the back of his neck or whatever, his prison lover, Charlie. And I remember thinking, yeah, this was really, and within Republican circles, Behan was read as a strictly political memoir, I think, or at least talked about in those ways, rather than with those other very clear connotations too. It's brilliant. It's all of Behan's work is tremendous. And again, but that aspect of Behan's life wasn't really acknowledged in criticism and scholarship, I think, until really the 80s. It was just kind of.
Oh, and homosexuality was decriminalised in 1993, June.
93, 1 year before I went to Dublin.
So 30 years issue.
So the last question from Jerry, he's very apologetic that he can't get on camera to do this himself, but he's said that your family backstory must surely motivate your writing. But he also has asked, did Wilde really become a devout Catholic following his stint in prison?
Yeah, certainly the family background motivates that motivates everything, and I think with everybody. It's Edward Said, the late great Edward Said, the literary critic, tells us that that this is what makes us, our experience informs our reading as active rather than passive readers, and it's always good to bring that into your reading. So I'm very happy about it, quite honoured too that informs my work, my writing and my scholarship and research, all of that. And then, sorry, what was the second part then of Jerry's question?
Whether or not Wilde became a devout Catholic
Right.
following his experience in Reading Gaol.
Yeah,
was he already Catholic and it
yeah.
reinvigorated that Catholicism?
I think it did. There's a rumor, not quite proven, but it's been claimed by one of his biographers. Was it? I think it was Robert Sherrod, actually, or possibly, I forget which one. One of the early biographers claims that his mother had him secretly baptized along with his brother Willie when Willie was born. And as Catholics, his mother definitely, she was Anglo-Irish Protestant. Her name was Jane Francesca L.G. Wilde, as was his father, Sir William Wilde. And not a Catholic Protestant, it's a construction in many ways, but in terms of social politics, class politics, colonialism in Ireland, it matters in the 19th century and still does. But the Wilde very closely identified with the Catholics and with the peasantry in particular, and he learned some Irish. His son recalls him singing lullabies in Gaelic to him. Vivian Holland, his son, in his book Son of Oscar Wilde, recalls that. His mother was her poem, The Famine Year, originally published as The Stricken Land, is very much about identification with the Irish who were really genocided during the 1840s with during An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, and then she calls it that. She describes it in the poem very much as a deliberate genocide. She identifies with the dispossessed, with the poor, and Wilde inherits that from her, and with the colonized, and then that informs everything. He's very fascinated by the Catholic Mass, Catholic symbolism, and that runs through, and it feeds into his own aestheticism then. And if the Catholic Mass is full of symbolism, isn't it? And yeah, Wilde appealed. He asked for conversion to Catholicism the day he was released from prison at a monastery in London, and was refused. So it's in a deathbed conversion eventually in the end. And but I think there is a very Catholic aesthetic that runs through all of his work, and it's very much. Jarlath Colleen has written a book about Wilde and religion. Jarlath Colleen at Trinity College in Dublin, and Anne Markey has written a brilliant book too about the ways in which the experience of the peasantry and their Catholicism informs is fairy tales as well.
Thanks ever so much for that. I'm wondering, you were talking about the fact that following his prison period, he was sort of written about as a broken man, and obviously what you've done is kind of disavow us of that. But I wonder who benefits from that narrative of him being broken. I mean, is this about still condemning homosexuality at the time, and therefore he had to be broken because the system had worked?
Yeah.
Or like, who benefits from that story?
This is the interesting thing, that with that narrative around Wilde, and again, it's something my mother pointed out to me. She remembers when Oscar was a more common name in Ireland, and then especially in the 50s and 60s, it disappears, and now it's very, very popular again. And her theory was that let's bury the name. Seemed to be the cultural response, shame and so on. And that's, there's an element of that, the shame with the containment. There's also for queer authors and writers too, it's very dangerous to be openly expressing one's sexuality. There is some amount of that going on, obviously a lot of it going on, especially in literary modernism, the movement that follows Wilde and so on, people like Radcliffe Hall and so on. But at the same time, there's a survival thing about this as well for many people. Wilde becomes an author who's sort of discussed not openly, but then you also have the state, and you have the education system as well, While you still have, there's still books being published about, there's been reviews of my book, for example, that bear the grudge here, but it's out in the open. There have been 2 reviews of my book by the same guy that claim that Wilde, wasn't that Irish, wasn't that radical, and his queerness now, because we can't deny that, is something that just was, and back then it couldn't be denied because that's what he was tried for. So the queerness is something that's by critics and by scholarship is something that up until, I would say, the 1960s, really, it comes back into fashion with fashion's the wrong word, really, but he becomes acknowledged and respected again. And that's part of the counterculture of the great counterculture of the 60s and 70s and so on. But there's still a lot of conservatism around the reading of Wilde. So yeah, it's suppressed for all these different reasons. And I think it's also attempted as just again, if you think of queer solidarities, I remember the first Derry Pride Festival, the first Foyle Pride Festival. We've a sacred site in Derry, Free Derry Corner, where social injustices are documented and displayed in solidarities and so on. And in 1993, that was the first Foyle Pride Festival. It was announced on Free Derry Corner with a billboard and a mural, and some people were very unpleased with that. And when you think of that as being, within an anti-colonial community, some people not a lot of people were very happy about it and very, very encouraged by it. So that's the kind of, that was still going on in the 1990s, that the queerness is acceptable, but at a remove, at a distance, and so on. And there obviously that ignores all kinds of solidarities and communities and everything too. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but if that answers the question to some extent, maybe.
I wore a Foyle Pride t-shirt to this year's Pride in Liverpool.
Oh, wonderful!
Because I was sent one, so just nice little tie-ins. Can I see anybody else's hand up? Does anybody else have a question? Fergal would like to come back in.
Right, Declan, what do you think Wilde would think about today's progress with LGBTQ plus and how it's become a lot more mainstream, whereas he spent most of his life trying to hide the fact until he was able to freely express himself? How do you think he would think about today?
I think, this is, and it's the great sort of tragedy of the Wilde family, his own family. Again, Joseph Bristow he's doing some very important archival research on Wilde and his relationship with his wife, Constance. She was her maiden name was Holland, Constance Holland. She marries and becomes Constance Wilde, and Professor Bristow argues that actually it wasn't a matter of the Wilde's underground life as it's been depicted. That she understood. He reckons that Wilde was gay or bisexual. He was seeing other men at their home, and so on. And it wasn't as straightforward as this narrative of Wilde running off with men and leaving the family and and neglect and so on. And the Constance, it was a very different kind of relationship, and so that today would still be, I think, in many ways, certainly in some sort of frowned upon, like open marriages and things like this. Wilde would be, I think, very happy about the way that LGBTQ plus people now have a very central role in all kinds of social discussions. He lived for the cause of inclusion in every way, and that's why I find him so fascinating, is that he never hesitated in expressing the solidarity, say, with the Irish peasantry or with the oppressed people in Russia, the anarchists and so on, and with those on the receiving end of police violence. And so Wilde would have been very pleased at how things are working out, but it's not something that's concluded yet. I was reading somewhere, I can't remember, was it Lenin who said that history is always in process and struggle is always in making. It's always being produced. And it's something that I think Wilde was very conscious of, but I think he would have been very happy about the decriminalisation of homosexuality in Ireland in 1993. And but even with that, there was a lot of a way to go in terms of rights and just not being, as Joseph Bristow has written about as well, and we've talked about, not being subjected to violence, the right not to be attacked beaten up or any of that stuff too. And Wilde felt about that for all communities. He was very consistent on that.
Do you think our background as being oppressed, or seeing ourselves as being oppressed, helped us to accept, the queer position, because we saw them as oppressed as well, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Most definitely. That's how he saw it. He saw these communities of solidarity. And it's something that, and again, there's a very
something we definitely understand. Community of solidarity, yeah. We definitely do understand that. So yeah,
and for a while that was something. So you've the anarchists, for example, when Wilde was imprisoned, when he was sentenced to 2 years hard labour, the anarchists who were centred around the newspaper The Torch actually write an editorial about Wilde being imprisoned, and they said that he was imprisoned for being a literary genius, for being Irish, for being a socialist and an anarchist, and also for being gay. So they said that while the conviction was for, as it was called, gross indecency, he was tried for those 5 things. And the anarchists said, listen, people, the state the state is not bothered about, going for a target that in this way. So we need to think about solidarities across, and Wilde lived that, and this is the genius of his work, is that it informs all of his literary work, and he as he acknowledged in De Profundis, he was at the center of cultural he was symbolic of the culture of his time. He stood in symbolic relation to the culture of his time, and yet he was infusing his literary writing with this. The fairy tales are full of that. They're often, again, depoliticized and just read as being either about religion or as stories for children sometimes, but they're, as Anne Markey has done so brilliantly in her book, and they're very much about politics too.
Thanks, Declan.
So, I'm sorry, there's just something coming up in the chat. So while I figure out how to process that, I'll just ask this other question that I was thinking of. If prison is wrong, what is the suggestion for what comes behind it? Like, what does progress look like?
Yeah, I think support from the state. It's actually, this is the thing. Conceptually, we think about doing away with prison but we can, and it's understandable. What'll come next? What'll we have? And I would say, like, proper social support for people, and it's going to take it'll take generations. But I do think that the traumas that lead people into prison, they begin early on. I think capitalism and imperialism are the two things that lead to it. So as long as we live under a capitalist system, we'll always have prisons and we'll always have prisoners. And increasingly too, now that prisons have become for-profit institutions, I think in terms of like policing within communities, for example, what you can have is like proper community policing, where, say, someone, I'm against policing as well, by the way, it's because it always ends badly, but some kind of collective responsibility, profound measures of collective responsibility within and between communities to deal not only with offences but also with offenders, understanding, because the prison system as it is, it's a disaster, and okay, in Britain and Ireland and parts of Europe it's not as bad as the United States, but that is where it's going, and I think that really, and this is what Wilde is calling for in this poem, is a community of understanding, of sympathy. Yeah. And again, it's something that it's in development. I don't have all the answers for it, but I think we need to talk about it. Yeah. And it's a great question, Emma, thanks, because it really brings Wilde's views, right into our moment. We've a prison system where recidivism or reoffending is off the scale. I was just reading about McYabury prison, where people are held outside of Belfast. That's a prison there, and the mental health problems that are being developed within the prison, cultivated there, and then being exported when people come out. Prison, even by its own standards, is supposed to reform the prisoner, and it's doing anything but. So there's something wrong with the concept of imprisonment.
Thank you ever so much for that. I'm mindful that we're coming up to an hour and a quarter and that
Yeah.
people's attentions might be going. I'm going to do a little bit of roundup. But can I just ask, is there anything that you would really like to recommend people go away and look at, if not the poem? Is there any kind of other reading that you'd recommend?
Any other recommended reading? Well, excuse me, Nicholas Frankel's book, Oscar Wilde, The Unrepentant Years. It's beautifully written. It's about his time after prison. It's just wonderful. And it really, it's a very moving book as well. There's also the wonderful Oscar Wilde and the Radical Politics of the Fin de Siècle, available from all good bookshops, which I've written myself. But it is an academic tome, so it can be a bit pricey. But if you order through your library, libraries are very keen to get these. That's my own book, and it is an academic tome, as is Frankel's. But Frankel's is it's just more accessible, I suppose, in that sense, that it's a more of a mass market book, but it's brilliant.
So you kind of preempted my next question, which was where can people find out more about your work? So can I just ask you to say that title once again?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful. Oscar Wilde and the Radical Politics of the Fin de Siècle, which is the end of century, late 19th century. It's available, I understand, in News from Nowhere locally in Liverpool. And Edinburgh University Press is the publisher. Edinburgh University Press. And you can see details about it on their website. And the other thing is there are some brilliant editions. There's a great Penguin edition of Oscar Wilde's prison writings, books related to it's a paperback. And also Professor Frankel, Nicholas Frankel, has brought out just recently an annotated edition of Wilde's prison writings. I think it's published by Harvard University Press. Yeah, I think it's Harvard or Yale, one of the others. But again, that's he explains in very, very fine detail and brilliantly the various all the things that really matter in between the text, between the sentences and the lines and so on, and the lines of poetry too.
Thanks ever so much for that. So I'm going to just do a little bit of wrapping up and then we'll say a big thank you to you. So if you just bear with me a tick. We've got a couple of other online events as part of this year's festival, each of which is connected with anniversary, as this one was. There's one called Conflict, Diaspora and Empire that's on next Wednesday. And we also have a Freya event about the services that have been provided to the survivors of Ireland's industrial homes and schools, etc. on Friday. To just pick up on something else that came up in the conversation earlier, Brendan Behan was mentioned, who of course came to Liverpool and ended up in a Borstal. But we actually have a play being put on next Saturday at the Tongue called Brendan, Son of Dublin. So anybody who's interested in following up on some more Irish literary work, we'd welcome you to come along to that event. If anybody wants to find out anything more about our programme, please visit liverpoolirishfestival.com/events, and you can follow us on social media platforms at Live Irish Fest. Declan wrote us an article this year which went into our newspaper, which is here, but it is also available online, and I'm just going to drop you all that into the chat so that you can see that there. But if you pick up a newspaper, it's on page 18. I'd just like to say thanks ever so much for all of you joining us. I really hope you've enjoyed this. If you would like to come back onto camera or at least onto mute, I'd welcome you to give Declan a round of applause and say thank you ever so much for being here.
Thank you.
So Declan and I are going to stay on now, but we welcome you all to leave the event. That's it.